Hey, this is Mr. Robinson. We're going to do a quick review over the Roaring Twenties, also known as the Jazz Age. In the 1920s, we see a new wave of prosperity. Many Americans are going to have more money than they had in previous decades. With that, we're going to see the rise of the automobile during this decade. It's a time of new economic prosperity, also new cultural values. But it didn't necessarily start out that way. At the end of World War I, Russia has a revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin. In this revolution, communism takes over. They rename their country the Soviet Union. Later, Russian immigrants move to the United States, and some of them bring with them the ideas of communism. This leads to something we call the Red Scare. Red is the symbol of communism, and Americans are afraid of communism spreading to the United States. In 1919, there's a series of coordinated attacks by anarchists on different government officials, including Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. He then directs J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI to round up suspected communists, many of them who are immigrants, and many are deported without any evidence of wrongdoing or without any warrants. We also see at this time the trial of two Italian immigrants, Seco and Vanzetti. They're on trial for bank robbery and murder. However, the evidence against them is pretty flimsy, but they are found guilty and executed, showing probably more of a nativist attitude rather than their guilt. So let's recap. Nativists are those who dislike immigrants. And what type of immigrants are facing the brunt of discrimination? Those from Eastern and Southern Europe. Eastern Europe like Russia, Southern Europe like Italy. And these people were termed the new immigrant, as opposed to the old immigrant from Northern Europe. Now, a little bit about the new immigrants. These people were mainly Catholics, so they had different religious views than the majority Protestant population at that time. And most of them did not speak English. And so they were seen as lacking in skills or in education, and as a threat to the economy. These nativist attitudes lead to a series of laws called the Immigration Acts, which restrict immigration for the first time from Europe, placing a quota system. Each country had a certain number of immigrants. Priority was given to immigrants from Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany, while Southern and Eastern Europe's immigrants were limited and Asians were banned altogether. You can see on the chart right here that the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had been increasing. After the Immigration Acts, we see that those immigrants are now decreasing. We're also going to see at this time the belief in something called eugenics, which was this idea that the human race could be improved by breeding, and that different races competed against each other for survival, just like plants and animals. And we've already explored this idea a little bit when we talked about social Darwinism and John Rockefeller explaining why he was rich, because he was better, he was stronger. And this is going to lead to laws that limit the ability of people to have children who are considered inferior, forced sterilizations, and marriage laws. In the 1920s, we're going to see three Republicans gain the White House: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. All three support a laissez-faire economics policy in regards to business. The first Republican president of the 1920s was Warren G. Harding, and he campaigned under a slogan of return to normalcy. We had just ended fighting World War I, so what was normal? Isolationism. Laissez-faire economics, keeping out of the world affairs. And under these policies, we are going to refuse to join the League of Nations. We're also going to restrict immigration at this time. And if you look at this cartoon that I drew, the turtle is going back into its shell, hiding from the rest of the world, going back to being isolated. So President Harding urged tolerance towards other races and supported greater rights for African Americans. However, he was marked by a couple of scandals during his presidency. First, he appointed some of his friends to positions of power. They were known as the Ohio Gang. Later, they're going to be accused of stealing money from the government. And then there was the Teapot Dome scandal, one of the worst scandals in our history, in which government officials sold land to friends for bribes. Shortly after the Teapot Dome scandal, President Harding has a stroke and dies. His vice president, Calvin Coolidge, takes over and has a very laissez-faire attitude towards the economy and keeps the government out of business. Calvin Coolidge serves 2 terms as president, and after him, Herbert Hoover is elected. Now, President Hoover had this idea called rugged individualism. He believed that people should basically take care of themselves, and that if the government interfered too much in people's lives, it would ruin a good thing. And in the 1920s, life was pretty good. Laissez-faire economics let businesses boom. We see the automobile rise. As production level increases, the price drops and more people can afford it. We see a lot of other industries rise at this time, such as new appliances. And it's this age of mass consumption where people are buying like never before. The number one factor behind the business boom of the 1920s was the automobile. 1 in 9 jobs were in an auto-related business. It stimulated the oil, steel, gas, and rubber industries, and car ownership rose from 8 million to 24 million during the decade. The benefit of the car included having more mobility, which meant you had the freedom to live farther away from your job if you didn't have to walk or ride a train. School buses could now bring rural students to attend school regularly for the first time, so education increases. And the country is no longer as isolated as you can get in your car and drive somewhere instead of waiting for transportation to come to you. The key person behind this industry was Henry Ford. He's going to pioneer the use of the assembly line to mass produce cars to lower the cost and increase the efficiency. In 1924, Ford was producing 1 car every 10 seconds, and the price was $300 per car. We also see new innovations like the vacuum cleaner, refrigerator, washing machine, coffee maker, stoves, which make life easier. We're also going to see the rise of the radio and motion pictures, which makes life more fun. We also see key innovators in the flight industry. The Wright brothers in 1902 became the first to fly. In 1908, Glenn Curtiss develops a plane that can land on water, leading to the birth of U.S. naval aviation. Now, there were some positives and negatives behind these new innovations. First, efficiency increased, so consumers benefited from cheaper products. You could buy more things. However, the improved efficiency meant that we no longer needed skilled workers. Unskilled workers could work on the assembly line without much training. With this wave of consumerism, we start to see advertising for the first time as companies begin to market to a national audience. And the more money a person made, the more things they wanted to buy. Now, you didn't always have enough cash to buy all the new stuff that you wanted, so we start to see credit for the first time, and people begin to buy on what's called installment plans, so that they could take the item home immediately and pay a little bit each month. But suddenly, Americans start to go into debt as they buy things they cannot afford. We also start to see people trying to get rich quick in the stock market, and the idea is to buy low and sell high. But as more and more people are buying into these stocks, the price artificially increases. Now, not everyone in the United States was having a great time in the Roaring '20s. With new farm equipment, electricity, and fertilizers, farmers faced lower incomes due to overproduction. There were just too many crops being grown, so the price is going to fall. Textile workers face competition for jobs with immigrants, and minority groups still face discrimination in employment and housing. Now, at the end of the Progressive Era, we see the temperance movement, and temperance were those who were against the drinking of alcohol. They were led by No Fun Francis Willard, and their efforts passed the 18th Amendment, which banned the production and sale of alcohol. Now, the idea behind the 18th Amendment was that if people drank less alcohol, crime rates would go down. However, people still want to drink, and so thousands of people who would normally not be breaking the law now go to speakeasies and drink illegal liquor. Many Americans were against prohibition, believing that it cost thousands of jobs as bars, breweries, and distilleries were closed. It also led to the rise of organized crimes, when gangsters like Al Capone became rich and famous from the illegal liquor trade. Prohibition is seen as a failed experiment, and in 1933 they repealed prohibition by passing the 21st Amendment. Another clash of culture in the 1920s was the Scopes monkey trial. Now, many states had passed laws that made it illegal to teach evolution. A teacher named John Scopes in Tennessee was accused of teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in his biology class. The two key figures were William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow. Now, William Jennings Bryan, if you remember him, he's the one who gave the famous Cross of Gold speech when he ran for president and was supported by the Populist Party. Clarence Darrow supported John Scopes and the theory of evolution, arguing that a teacher has a First Amendment right to teach what they want. Now, Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution and forced to pay a fine, which was later rescinded. However, this trial showed that Americans had to come to grips with modern science and their traditional religious beliefs. And these emergence of new values, such as new music, new art and literature, provided the opportunity to express new freedoms, but others saw these changing values as a threat to their way of life. One group that experiences rapid change in the 1920s was women. Now, during World War I, many women had gotten jobs in factories as men went off to fight the war. And women also win the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. These new freedoms lead women to start to fight for equality with men. Now, with these new freedoms came a new independence, and many young women started to take more risks, cut their hair short, dance to jazz music, drink illegal liquor, and these people were known as the flappers. Now look at the two images, image A and image B. You can see how image B shows how the change in roles of women showed the newfound freedoms they experienced in the 1920s. Now in 1910, New York City became the most famous publisher of sheet music, as thousands of Americans had pianos. The area of New York called Tin Pan Alley was the center of this new cultural activity. Not everyone accepts these new cultural values. A group of authors known as the Lost Generation, which includes F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote the book The Great Gatsby, reject the materialism of the time, saying that America had lost their way. African Americans also experienced rapid change in the 1920s. Thousands of African Americans leave the rural South in search of industrial jobs in northern cities in places like New York and Chicago. This was known as the Great Migration. As these African Americans move to these northern cities, they start to bring with them their culture, which leads to a shift in culture in northern cities, especially in a place called Harlem, which is a section of New York City. The Great Migration led to a resurgence of African American culture in northern cities. This was known as the Harlem Renaissance, as new forms of music, dance, visual arts, literature, and poetry came out of Harlem, New York. There were very many important African American authors during the Harlem Renaissance, such as Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Zora Neale Hurston. Many African Americans still face discrimination and racism in northern cities. This set the stage for the Back to Africa movement, led by a man named Marcus Garvey, who advocated for the mass migration of African Americans back to the continent of Africa, where they could create their own countries and governments. One of the most popular people in the 1920s was Charles Lindbergh, who became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, which made him a national hero and opened the way for commercial flights between America and Europe. So let's recap. The 1920s was a time of great change and prosperity for some, while a fear of communism, immigrants, and alcohol created feelings of mistrust, hatred, and unlawfulness in others. The 1920s saw women's suffrage, the flappers, the rise of the automobile, the Harlem Renaissance, new technologies, which made it a very exciting time to live. But the roar of the 1920s comes to a screeching halt with the stock market crash and the beginnings of the Great Depression.